The unseen power of humility. The Majestic Pearl, one of Los Angeles' most prestigious luxury hotels, was known for catering to the elite. Celebrities, billionaires, and socialites considered it their personal playground, a haven of exclusivity, extravagance, and power. The marble-floored lobby, dripping in golden chandeliers and custom Italian furniture, was always bustling with high-profile guests and their entourages. That afternoon, Tiffany Lancaster, a 26-year-old heiress, influencer, and self-proclaimed socialite, stormed through the entrance with her designer heels clicking against the polished floor. Her frustration was palpable, evident in the sharp way she gestured at her assistant, Samantha, and best friend, Brianna, both of whom followed behind like loyal shadows. "This is unacceptable," Tiffany snapped, tossing her diamond-encrusted Chanel handbag onto the front desk with an unnecessary amount of force. The receptionist, a young woman named Emily, swallowed hard, already aware of the storm that was about to descend upon her. Tiffany's problem. Her usual penthouse suite was unavailable. A technical glitch in the booking system meant she had been assigned a slightly lesser suite on the 30th floor instead of the exclusive top-floor penthouse she considered her birthright. "I booked that suite weeks ago," Tiffany huffed, crossing her arms. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Emily tried to remain composed. "Ms. Lancaster, we deeply apologize for the inconvenience. We've upgraded your current suite with additional amenities and complimentary services." "I don't want complimentary services. I want the suite I paid for," Tiffany interrupted, tossing her platinum blonde hair over her shoulder. "This is supposed to be my relaxing getaway before my birthday party in Monaco. Do you understand what stress does to my skin?" Behind her, Brianna and Samantha exchanged nervous glances. They were used to Tiffany's meltdowns, but this was bad even for her. Seated in the corner of the lobby, a man watched the scene unfold with quiet amusement. Keanu Reeves, dressed in a worn leather jacket, dark jeans, and a simple black shirt, he was the last person anyone would suspect of being the hotel's owner. He sipped his black coffee leisurely, his warm brown eyes scanning the situation without interference. He had seen people like Tiffany before, the type who believed that wealth equaled importance, who measured a person's worth by the labels they wore and the money in their bank accounts. It wasn't new, and it wasn't impressive. What was impressive, however, was watching how the staff handled it with grace and patience. He had built the Majestic Pearl on a foundation of respect, dignity, and exceptional service, and watching Emily hold her composure despite Tiffany's entitled tantrum made him proud. But what happened next changed everything. The mistaken identity. As Keanu set down his coffee cup and casually approached the front desk, he was still completely unnoticed by Tiffany. She was too caught up in her frustration, too self-absorbed to even glance at him. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently against the counter as she exhaled dramatically. "Can someone competent please fix this?" Then her eyes landed on Keanu, who had just stepped beside her, and she immediately assumed he was staff. "You," she snapped, pointing at him with the air of a queen addressing a peasant. "Can you do something about my room?" There was no hesitation in her tone, no pause to wonder who he might actually be. Keanu blinked slowly, suppressing a smile of disbelief. Tiffany cut him off before he could speak. "Look, I don't care if you're the janitor, security, or whatever. You work here, right? So fix my suite situation." The entire room fell silent. The hotel staff froze, barely able to contain their reactions. Several guests, seated in plush leather chairs in the waiting area, stared with wide eyes, whispering amongst themselves. Even Brianna inhaled sharply, realizing that something was very, very off. But Tiffany, she was completely oblivious. Keanu, ever the epitome of patience and grace, tilted his head slightly, studying her with an unreadable expression. He could have corrected her. He could have simply told her the truth. But instead, he decided to see this through. "Ma'am," he said with a calmness that only made Tiffany's irritation grow, "is there something I can assist you with?" Tiffany rolled her eyes, exasperated. Yes, my suite isn't available, and I need it fixed. I spent more on these shoes than you probably make in a year, so let's move with some urgency, all right? A few staff members gasped quietly. Tiffany's arrogance was astounding. Keanu's lips twitched in what might have been amusement, or maybe disappointment. He glanced over at Emily, who looked like she was about to sink into the floor from second-hand embarrassment. Then he looked back at Tiffany. "I'll personally ensure your concerns are addressed," he said simply. Tiffany smirked, looking satisfied with herself. Good. Maybe you'll finally be useful for something. What she didn't notice was the subtle shift in the energy of the room. Hotel staff exchanged knowing glances, their lips twitching as they desperately tried to hold back their reactions. Some guests watched with thinly veiled anticipation, while Brianna bit her lip so hard she nearly drew blood. The reason? Tiffany had just insulted the very man who owned the entire hotel chain. And she had no idea. The power of poise. Instead of reacting, Keanu simply nodded. "I'll see what I can do." He then turned to Emily and spoke softly. "Please prepare the VIP suite for Ms. Lancaster. Upgrade it beyond the penthouse. Full hospitality package, spa, fine dining, private lounge access, the works." Tiffany's smirk deepened. Finally, someone was treating her the way she deserved. Brianna, on the other hand, suddenly looked concerned. Something wasn't right. But before she could question anything, Keanu glanced back at Tiffany, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. "Enjoy your stay, Ms. Lancaster," he said. "We'll take great care of you." And then he walked away. Tiffany turned to Brianna, grinning. "See, you just have to demand excellence from people." Brianna, however, could only stare after Keanu, a dawning horror creeping into her features. "Tiffany," she whispered, "do you know who that was?" Tiffany scoffed. "What does it matter? He's just some hotel guy. Now let's go see my suite." Brianna winced, because she knew, and very, very soon. Tiffany was about to learn the hard way. The price of arrogance. Tiffany Lancaster strode confidently toward the elevator, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor of the majestic Pearl. She had no doubt that her demands had been met. After all, people like her always got what they wanted. That maintenance worker, or whatever he was, had seemed eager to please, and Tiffany had no reason to think twice about him. She was too busy reveling in her own self-importance, oblivious to the whispers that followed her as she walked through the lobby. Her assistant, Samantha, trailed nervously behind, clutching Tiffany's bags, while Brianna remained unusually quiet. Something about the interaction at the front desk had felt off. She had seen the way the staff had exchanged glances, the way they had suppressed smirks. It was as if they all knew something Tiffany didn't. And then there was the man. The one Tiffany had snapped at, the one who had remained perfectly calm, completely unaffected by her attitude. That was what unsettled Brianna the most. She had seen plenty of hotel managers, concierges, and staff members grovel in Tiffany's presence, bending over backward to meet her ridiculous demands. But that man, he had never once lost his composure. Who the hell was he? As they stepped into the private elevator that led to the upper suites, Brianna hesitated before speaking. "Tiff, I think you might have just messed up." Tiffany scoffed, barely glancing at her. "Messed up? I got exactly what I wanted, didn't I?" Brianna exhaled, crossing her arms. "Did you even hear the way the staff reacted when you talked to that guy? It was like they were all in on something." Tiffany waved her off, staring at her reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls and adjusting her perfectly curled blonde hair. Bri, stop being dramatic. He's probably some assistant manager or something, and if he knows what's good for him, he'll make sure my suite is exactly the way I want it." Brianna, however, couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. She had seen that man before, but she couldn't quite place where. And the way the staff had tried not to laugh. That meant something. Something big. a suite unlike any other. When the elevator doors dinged open, Tiffany stepped out with an air of victory, expecting nothing short of perfection. But what she saw stopped her in her tracks. Her jaw dropped. The suite wasn't just an upgrade. It was beyond anything she had ever stayed in before, even at the most elite resorts. The ceilings stretched impossibly high, adorned with custom crystal chandeliers that glittered like stars. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Los Angeles, the city lights stretching endlessly into the horizon. There was a private infinity pool on the balcony, a fully stocked bar, and a gold-trimmed grand piano in the center of the room, as if placed there just to remind guests how truly out of this world this suite was. Tiffany blinked in disbelief. Even for someone like her, someone accustomed to luxury, privilege, and excess, this was next level. Her lips curled into a smirk. "Well," she said, tossing her purse onto a plush velvet chaise lounge, "I suppose they finally realized who they're dealing with." Brianna, however, was not as quick to celebrate. Something was wrong. The entire situation felt too perfect, too well orchestrated, like the setup to a joke she hadn't been let in on. And then she noticed something. A bottle of 1990 crystal champagne sat chilling on the hand-carved mahogany bar, exactly what Tiffany had demanded earlier. But it wasn't the champagne itself that sent a chill down Brianna's spine. It was the handwritten note attached to it. She stepped forward cautiously, plucking the card from the bottle's neck, her fingers slightly trembling. The writing was neat, elegant, and unmistakably intentional. She read the words twice before her stomach dropped. "Enjoy your stay, Ms. Lancaster. We'll take great care of you. K.R." Brianna's breath hitched. K.R. No, it couldn't be. Her hands shook as she turned to Tiffany, who was admiring herself in the mirror, blissfully unaware of the storm about to hit her. "Tiff." Brianna's voice was unsteady. Tiffany barely glanced at her. "What now?" Brianna swallowed hard. "I know who that man was." Tiffany rolled her eyes, impatient. "Ah, who cares?" Brianna took a deep, bracing breath. "You should, because the guy you just insulted and treated like a servant." Tiffany finally turned, frowning at the urgency in Brianna's voice. Brianna locked eyes with her and dropped the bombshell. That was Keanu Reeves. The moment it clicked. Silence. For the first time since they had entered the hotel, Tiffany froze. She stared at Brianna, her mind racing, trying to process the name, the initials, the note. And then it hit her. The calm demeanor, the undeniable presence, the way the staff had reacted to him. Tiffany suddenly felt ice cold. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. That's not possible." Brianna exhaled sharply, gripping the note in her fist. "It is." Tiffany's stomach plummeted. She had humiliated Keanu Reeves, and he hadn't said a word. He hadn't defended himself. He had simply let her do it. Her knees felt weak. Brianna smirked, shaking her head. "Oh, Tiff, you're so screwed." The realization sets in. Tiffany staggered back, her body pressing against the cool glass of the suite's massive window. Flashes of their interaction replayed in her mind. The way she had spoken down to him, the condescending snap of her fingers, the arrogant assumption that he was beneath her, and he had let her believe it. The worst part, she had no idea what he was going to do next. Was he setting her up for something? Was this whole upgrade just a trap to humiliate her in return? Why had he given her the best suite in the hotel? Tiffany's heart pounded. For the first time in her privileged, entitled life, she realized something earth-shattering. Money didn't make her powerful. Arrogance didn't make her important. And there were some people in the world you just couldn't buy. And Keanu Reeves. He was one of them. Tiffany swallowed hard, knowing that the next 24 hours were about to change everything. The weight of consequence. Tiffany Lancaster had never experienced humility before. Not truly. For as long as she could remember, life had revolved around her desires, her expectations, and her ability to bend people to her will. Money was the great equalizer, the ultimate tool that ensured she always got what she wanted. From exclusive VIP access to luxury yachts to private jets on a whim, she had never once been denied anything she demanded. Until now. Until Keanu Reeves. As she stood in the extravagant VIP suite, staring blankly at the elegant handwritten note, a strange sensation spread through her chest. It wasn't anger. No, that was her default reaction to anything that didn't go her way. This was something else. Dread. Her assistant, Samantha, remained silent, as if too afraid to breathe, while Brianna simply folded her arms, a knowing smirk dancing at the corners of her lips. Tiffany had been blind, too self-absorbed to recognize the man standing before her, and now the realization was sinking in like an anchor, dragging her into the depths of reality. She had humiliated Keanu Reeves. The same Keanu Reeves who was revered for his humility, respected for his kindness, and untouchable by Hollywood's toxic elite. The same Keanu Reeves who owned the very hotel she had been throwing a tantrum in. And he had let her. No correction, no ego-driven rebuttal, just patience. That made it so much worse. A crisis of reputation. Tiffany paced back and forth, her designer heels clicking against the marble floors of her upgraded suite, the view of Los Angeles stretching endlessly beneath her feet. The towering skyline should have made her feel invincible, as it always did. Instead, it only reminded her of how small she felt in this moment. "This can't be happening," she muttered under her breath, running a manicured hand through her perfectly styled hair. "This cannot be happening." Brianna, who had taken a seat on one of the velvet chaise lounges, tilted her head in amusement. "Oh, it's happening, babe. You just belittled one of the most beloved men in the world, and the worst part, you had no idea." Tiffany whirled around, glowering at her so-called best friend. "This isn't funny." Brianna raised an eyebrow. "It's a little funny." Samantha, who had been scrolling on her phone frantically, let out a small gasp. "Oh no." Tiffany's stomach twisted into knots. She hated that tone. It was the kind of "oh no" that meant something terrible had just surfaced online. "What?" she demanded. Samantha hesitated. "There are some videos." Tiffany snatched the phone from her hands and stared at the screen. Social media was already ablaze. Clips from the hotel's security footage had leaked. Short, damning snippets of her snapping her fingers at Keanu, the way she looked him up and down with disdain, the moment she mocked his paycheck. But it wasn't just the video that made her stomach drop. It was the comments. How do people like this even exist? This is why money doesn't buy class. She really thinks she's better than Keanu Reeves. The internet is never letting her live this down. Keanu literally owns the hotel, and she treated him like a janitor. Instant karma incoming. Tiffany's face turned pale. She had been trending before, usually for flaunting her designer outfits or posting vacation selfies in the Maldives. But never like this. Never as the villain. Her entire brand was built on exclusivity, influence, and power. But now, she was becoming a joke, the unspoken judgment. As panic took root in her chest, there was a sudden knock at the door. The entire room went silent. Tiffany froze, her breath hitching. Brianna smirked. "Oh, this is about to get good." Samantha swallowed hard. "What if it's—" Tiffany didn't let her finish. With a deep breath, she straightened her posture, smoothing out her designer dress, as if that alone could reclaim her dignity. Then she opened the door, and there he was. Keanu Reeves stood in the doorway, still dressed in the same effortlessly casual attire, the same look that had fooled her into thinking he was a nobody. But now she knew better. Now she could feel the weight of who he was. He didn't speak immediately. He simply looked at her, his expression calm, unreadable, and that made it worse. If he had yelled, if he had fired back insults, Tiffany could have written it off as just another power play. But he wasn't playing. He was just existing, and somehow, that was more powerful than anything she could ever be. "Miss Lancaster," he finally said, his voice even. "Enjoying your stay?" Tiffany's throat went dry. There was no smugness in his tone, no triumph, no sarcasm, just genuine curiosity. And that made her feel 10 times worse. She opened her mouth to speak, to say what she wasn't even sure, but nothing came out. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "I imagine this is not how you expected your visit to go." Tiffany's nails dug into her palm. She hated this. She hated feeling exposed. But most of all, she hated the sinking realization that she had done this to herself. Finally, with a deep, controlled breath, she did something she had never done before. She lowered her gaze. "I was rude to you," she admitted, her voice almost foreign to her own ears. "I didn't know who you were." Keanu studied her for a moment before responding. "Would it have mattered if I wasn't who I am?" Tiffany felt the air leave her lungs. She had no response, because they both knew the answer. It wouldn't have mattered. She still would have snapped her fingers. She still would have mocked him. Because that's who she was. Or at least, that's who she had been. The weight of that realization settled over her, heavy and inescapable. Keanu nodded slightly, as if seeing the understanding dawn in her eyes. "I believe in second chances," he said simply, "but they have to be earned." Tiffany swallowed hard. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being handed something. She was being challenged. Keanu turned slightly, motioning toward the elevator. "Join me downstairs," he said, his tone as casual as if he were inviting an old friend for coffee. "There's something I want you to see." Tiffany hesitated. She had never been invited into a situation she didn't control. But something deep in her gut told her that if she ignored this opportunity, she'd regret it for the rest of her life. Taking a shaky breath, she nodded. "Okay." Brianna's eyes widened slightly. Even Samantha looked shocked. But Tiffany didn't care. Because for the first time ever, she was walking into something without knowing the outcome. And that terrified her. A lesson in true wealth. The elevator ride down to the lobby was silent, heavy with an unspoken tension that wrapped around Tiffany like a suffocating cloak. She stood beside Keanu Reeves, her mind racing in a way it never had before. For the first time in her life, she was not in control of the situation. She couldn't manipulate the outcome with money, power, or privilege. This was different. Keanu's presence was impossibly calm, as if he carried the weight of the world with an ease she had never learned. He didn't look at her with anger or judgment, and somehow that made it so much worse. If he had yelled at her, if he had humiliated her in return, it would have been easier. She was used to battles of ego, used to the sharp claws of high society where status was everything. But Keanu, he wasn't playing by the same rules. And that terrified her. As the elevator dinged open, the grand lobby of the majestic Pearl unfolded before them once more. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of golden chandeliers. Guests moved about gracefully, dressed in designer attire, sipping on champagne, and indulging in the luxury that this hotel promised. And yet Keanu led her away from it all. Beyond the illusions of status, Tiffany's heels clicked against the floor as she followed him through a private side entrance, one that led through a hallway she had never noticed before. It wasn't lined with extravagant art or gold-framed mirrors. Instead, the walls were adorned with photographs, not of celebrities or famous guests, but of employees, past and present. Keanu stopped in front of a particular black-and-white image, a candid shot of a young man in his early 20s mopping the hotel floors late at night. His face held an undeniable determination, a quiet strength that was easy to overlook. Tiffany's eyes flickered toward Keanu, who studied the picture with something close to fondness. "This was me," he said simply. Tiffany's heart skipped a beat. She turned to him, blinking in disbelief. "You? Worked here?" Keanu nodded. "Before I ever had a name, before I ever had money, before I ever set foot on a movie set, I was just another guy trying to survive." He glanced at her, a knowing look in his eyes. Life wasn't always red carpets and luxury hotels. Tiffany felt her throat tighten. She had never considered this possibility. She had assumed Keanu had always been successful, always been wealthy, because that's how the world worked in her mind. People were either born into privilege or they weren't. She had never considered the struggle it took to get there. Keanu motioned for her to keep walking, leading her through another discreet doorway. The moment Tiffany stepped inside, she was hit with something she had never seen before in a five-star hotel. The heart of the hotel. The room was simple, a well-lit space where employees gathered for their breaks, away from the eyes of high-profile guests. Unlike the rest of the hotel, this place felt human, lived in. Several staff members sat around modest tables, some sharing quiet conversations, others reading books or simply relaxing before their shifts. This was the part of luxury hotels no one ever thought about. The people who made it all happen. Tiffany had spent her entire life in places like this, yet she had never acknowledged the existence of these workers. To her, hotel staff had always been background characters, people who existed solely to meet her needs. Now, standing in their space, she felt like an outsider. Keanu looked around the room, his eyes warm with familiarity. This wasn't just his hotel. This was his home. These people, he said, gesturing toward the employees, they're the ones who make this place what it is. Not the chandeliers, not the marble floors. Them. Tiffany's stomach twisted. She had mocked one of these people earlier. She had belittled him. And she had no doubt that every single worker in this room knew it. As if on cue, one of the senior housekeeping staff, an older woman with kind eyes and tired hands, stepped forward. She smiled at Keanu with genuine affection. "It's good to see you again, boss." Keanu returned the smile. "It's been a while, Maria." Maria's gaze then shifted to Tiffany, and the warmth in her eyes dimmed just slightly. Tiffany swallowed hard, knowing exactly what that meant. This woman had been working here long enough to see people like her all the time. People who never acknowledged the workers, never thanked them, never even looked them in the eye. And suddenly, Tiffany felt incredibly small. Keanu turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "You asked me earlier if I worked here," he said. "The truth is, I still do." Tiffany's brows furrowed. "But you own the place." Keanu nodded. "And ownership means nothing if you don't understand the people who built it." Tiffany had never heard wealth described that way before. She had always seen money as a measure of power, a means to separate yourself from those beneath you. But Keanu saw it differently. To him, true power wasn't in owning the hotel. It was in respecting the people who made it what it was. The shift. A long silence stretched between them. Tiffany, for once, didn't have a snarky comment, didn't have an excuse, didn't have an escape route. She was trapped in the reality of her own ignorance, forced to face the ugly truth of who she had become. For the first time, she asked herself a question she had never asked before. What if I've been wrong about everything? She exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting toward Maria, then to the other workers who still watched her with quiet judgment. And then, in a moment that even surprised herself, Tiffany did something she had never done in her entire life. She turned to Maria, and she apologized. Tiffany hesitated, the words foreign in her mouth. "I was rude earlier. To Keanu. To the staff. To you." She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to look Maria in the eyes. "I'm sorry." Maria didn't react immediately. Then, after a moment, she gave a small nod. "People like you don't usually apologize." Tiffany swallowed. "I know." Maria studied her for a long moment. Then, to Tiffany's surprise, smiled. "It's never too late to learn." Keanu, standing beside them, nodded in quiet approval. And in that moment, something inside Tiffany shifted. For the first time in her life, she realized that being rich had never truly made her powerful. But learning to respect people, learning to be better, that just might. A new perspective. As Keanu led her out of the employee quarters, Tiffany glanced back one last time. The workers had already gone back to their conversations, but something was different now. They weren't just employees anymore. They were people. Keanu walked beside her, silent as they re-entered the glamorous part of the hotel. Tiffany took a deep breath, then looked at him. "Thank you," she said softly. Keanu tilted his head, amused. "For what?" Tiffany hesitated before answering. "For showing me what I should have seen all along." Keanu simply smiled. That's what second chances are for. And for the first time in her life, Tiffany Lancaster wanted to earn hers. The weight of change. Tiffany Lancaster sat alone in her massive VIP suite, staring out at the Los Angeles skyline. But for the first time in her life, the breathtaking view felt empty. The city had always represented power, status, and achievement to her. Each towering skyscraper was a symbol of who belonged and who didn't. And yet, after the events of today, after walking through the heart of the hotel, standing among the very people who made luxury possible, and facing her own arrogance, she wasn't sure she belonged anywhere anymore. Her reflection in the glass window stared back at her. Flawless makeup, designer dress, everything about her outward appearance perfectly curated, just as it always had been. But beneath the surface, she felt small. For the first time, she understood just how blind she had been. Keanu Reeves had given her something no one else in her life ever had. A reality check. And it wasn't the kind she could buy her way out of. A different kind of invitation. A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Her heart skipped for a second before she composed herself. She took a deep breath, smoothing down the fabric of her dress before standing. When she opened the door, Keanu stood there, as calm and collected as ever, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. Tiffany blinked. Of all the things she expected, this wasn't one of them. "You drink coffee at night?" she asked, her voice lighter than she expected. Keanu smirked slightly. "I do a lot of things people don't expect." He handed her a cup. "Mind if I come in?" Tiffany hesitated. It wasn't that she didn't want to let him in. It was that for the first time in her life, she felt like she had to earn someone's respect. Still, she stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. Keanu walked in as if he owned the place, which, technically, he did, but his presence wasn't overbearing or arrogant. It was easy, natural, the way someone comfortable in their own skin moved. He took a seat in one of the plush armchairs, sipping his coffee. Tiffany sat across from him, suddenly feeling like a student in front of a teacher. "Why are you here?" she finally asked, her voice quieter than before. Keanu set his cup down on the glass table between them, his dark eyes studying her. "Because I want to know if today actually meant something to you." Tiffany's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. She could lie. She could say what he wanted to hear, make some empty promise about being a better person. That was easy. But hadn't she spent her whole life taking the easy way out? She exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to change overnight." Keanu leaned back in his chair. "Good. That means you actually want to." Tiffany's brows furrowed. "What?" Keanu gave a small, knowing smile. People who don't care will say whatever it takes to move past an uncomfortable moment. But the people who actually feel the weight of their mistakes, they struggle with it. They don't have the answers right away. Tiffany swallowed hard. He was right. And that terrified her. She had spent years crafting an image, a persona that exuded perfection, confidence, and superiority. To admit that she was wrong, to admit that she didn't have it all figured out, felt like ripping off a mask she had worn for so long that she had forgotten what was underneath. She let out a breath. "So what now?" Keanu tilted his head. "That depends on you." Tiffany frowned. "What do you mean?" Keanu took another sip of coffee before setting it down. "You have 2 choices. 1. You go back to your life, pretend today never happened, keep living in your bubble of luxury and entitlement, and tell yourself you don't need to change." He let that sink in before continuing. Or 2. You take everything you've learned today and do something about it. Tiffany's stomach tightened. She had expected a lecture, maybe even some judgment. But this was different. Keanu wasn't telling her what to do. He was putting the decision in her hands. And for the first time, she wanted to make the right one. An unlikely offer. Tiffany took a slow sip of her coffee, thinking hard before speaking. And if I choose the second option? Keanu's lips twitched slightly. Then I have something for you. Tiffany raised an eyebrow. A gift. Keanu chuckled. Not exactly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple white envelope. Tiffany hesitated before taking it. She flipped it over, her heart pounding slightly as she opened it and pulled out the paper inside. An airline ticket. Her confusion deepened as she read the destination. Colombia, she asked, looking up at Keanu with disbelief. Keanu nodded. There's a charity I work with down there. They build homes, schools, and medical clinics for underprivileged communities. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. I want you to go there. Spend a month seeing what life is like outside the world you've always known. Tiffany stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. You want me to go to a third world country? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Keanu didn't blink. Yes. Tiffany let out a small laugh, shaking her head. I don't think I'm exactly humanitarian material. Keanu smirked. That's the point. She blinked. This isn't about fixing your image or proving anything to anyone, he continued. It's about getting out of your own way. Seeing a world that doesn't revolve around designer clothes and luxury hotels. Understanding what real struggle looks like. Tiffany bit her lip, staring at the ticket. Everything inside her screamed to say no. This was insane. This wasn't her world, her reality. But another part of her, the part that had felt her stomach drop when she realized how horribly she had treated Keanu, the part of her that had seen the hotel workers for the first time as real people, that part whispered, maybe this is exactly what you need. She looked back at Keanu. You really think I'm capable of this? Keanu's expression softened. I think everyone is capable of change. The question is, are you willing to try? Tiffany stared at the ticket for a long time. She thought about the world she knew, the parties, the exclusivity, the people who only cared about their next luxury purchase. And then she thought about Maria, the hotel worker who had looked at her with quiet disappointment, and the way it had stung more than anything ever had. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded. I'll go, she said, her voice steady. Keanu smiled, not smug, not victorious, but genuinely pleased. Good, he said simply. Tiffany exhaled slowly, staring at the ticket. For the first time in her entire life, she wasn't just following the script of who she was expected to be. She was choosing something different, and something told her she would never be the same again. A journey into the unknown. The private jet hummed softly beneath Tiffany as she sat stiffly in her seat, staring out the window at the vast stretch of blue sky. The first-class luxury of the aircraft was nothing new to her. She had traveled like this countless times before. But this time, she wasn't heading to Paris for Fashion Week or Monaco for a yacht party. This time, she was going to Colombia. A month ago, the very idea would have made her laugh. Tiffany Lancaster, heiress to a multimillion-dollar empire, on a volunteer trip. The concept was absurd, but everything had changed since that day at the Majestic Pearl. Keanu Reeves had challenged her in a way no one else ever had, not with anger or humiliation, but with a simple choice, and for the first time in her life, she had chosen something unknown. She still wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way she had felt when she walked through the employees' quarters, realizing the people she had ignored for years had lives, dreams, and struggles she had never considered. Maybe it was the weight of Maria's quiet disapproval, the mirror it had forced her to look into. Or maybe it was because she was tired of being Tiffany Lancaster, the shallow rich girl who had everything but meant nothing. Whatever the reason, she was here now. And there was no turning back. Landing in a different world. The moment she stepped off the plane in Cartagena, Colombia, she was hit by a wave of humid tropical air so different from the crisp, climate-controlled environments she was used to. The scent of sea salt, spices, and something earthy filled the air, mingling with the distant sound of street music. A man in a simple white button-down and jeans held a sign that read Tiffany Lancaster, Foundation Esperanza. She clutched her Louis Vuitton carry-on tightly as she approached him, feeling completely out of place in her designer travel outfit. "Señorita Lancaster?" the man asked in a polite but not overly enthusiastic tone. Yeah," she said awkwardly, shifting on her heels. The man nodded and gestured toward a dusty old truck parked nearby. "I'm Matteo. I'll be taking you to the village." Tiffany hesitated. That was the car. She had expected a chauffeured black SUV, maybe even a private driver from a five-star hotel. Instead, she was staring at a beat-up pickup truck with chipped paint and a cracked windshield. For the first time, it truly sank in. This wasn't a vacation. This was real. The road to reality. The drive was long and bumpy, the paved roads of the city giving way to dirt paths as they ventured deeper into the countryside. Tiffany's perfectly styled hair clung to her face as sweat beaded on her skin, her expensive silk blouse already sticking uncomfortably to her back. She had never felt so out of place in her life. But Matteo didn't seem to care. He hummed softly as he drove, navigating the uneven roads with practiced ease. After a long stretch of silence, he finally spoke. "You look nervous," he said simply, his eyes still on the road. Tiffany exhaled, staring out at the endless stretch of rolling green hills. I guess I am." Matteo nodded, as if this didn't surprise him. "People who come here for the first time usually are." Tiffany bit her lip. "You've seen a lot of people like me, huh?" Matteo chuckled, though there was no cruelty in it. "Sigh. Some rich volunteers come for a week, take pictures with the kids, post on social media, and then leave. Others stay longer. You can always tell who actually wants to change." Tiffany's stomach twisted. She wasn't sure which category she fell into yet. Meeting the people she once ignored. By the time they reached the village, the sun was starting to set, casting a golden glow over the modest houses made of wood and brick, with tin roofs and colorful hand-painted murals. Children ran barefoot through the dusty streets, their laughter echoing in the air. Tiffany stepped out of the truck carefully, feeling the village's eyes on her. She didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. A woman in a flowing skirt and a simple white blouse approached, smiling warmly. "Señorita Lancaster, welcome. I am Camila, the coordinator of Foundation Esperanza." Tiffany forced a smile. "Nice to meet you." Camila's eyes flickered over her outfit, not in judgment, but with amusement. "You might want to change into something more practical," she suggested. Tiffany glanced down at her designer sandals and silk blouse, suddenly realizing just how ridiculous she looked here. She nodded quickly. "Yeah, that's probably a good idea." The humbling first night. After changing into simple jeans, sneakers, and a cotton t-shirt, clothes borrowed from another volunteer, Tiffany was led to her temporary lodging, a small room in a shared guest house, with a thin mattress, no air conditioning, and a single overhead fan that creaked when it spun. Her entire life, she had stayed in five-star resorts, private villas, and suites that cost more per night than most people made in a month. Now, she was staring at a room smaller than her walk-in closet. She wanted to complain, wanted to demand better accommodations. But then she remembered Maria. She remembered the hotel workers back in Los Angeles, the people who worked 10 times harder than she ever had just to afford a life she had taken for granted. And suddenly, the room didn't seem so bad. Dinner among strangers and friends. That night, Tiffany sat at a long wooden table in the open-air community center, surrounded by locals and volunteers. The meal was simple but rich with flavor: grilled plantains, rice, beans, and fresh fruit. For the first time in years, she wasn't dining at a Michelin-star restaurant, sipping wine from a $500 bottle. She was eating with her hands, laughing as a little girl named Sophia taught her how to peel a mango properly. She was listening to people's stories, real stories of struggle, resilience, and hope. And somewhere in the middle of it all, she realized something shocking. She wasn't thinking about her reputation, her social media, or what designer bag she'd buy next. She was just there, present, and it felt strangely freeing. The first step toward change. That night, as Tiffany lay on her thin mattress, staring up at the ceiling fan, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. A sense of purpose. She wasn't sure what came next. She wasn't sure if this trip would actually change her. But for the first time in her life, she was open to the possibility. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Becoming someone new. The morning sun rose over the small Colombian village, casting a warm, golden light across the modest homes and dusty roads. The sounds of roosters crowing and children laughing drifted through the air, blending with the rhythmic hammering of construction workers repairing a nearby schoolhouse. Tiffany Lancaster stirred from her sleep, feeling the unfamiliar sensation of waking up without the comfort of Egyptian cotton sheets, blackout curtains, or a perfectly regulated air-conditioned room. Instead, she lay on a thin mattress in a room no bigger than the storage closet back at her penthouse in Beverly Hills. The ceiling fan creaked overhead, struggling against the morning heat. A mosquito buzzed near her ear, and for a split second, her old self wanted to complain, to curse, to demand better conditions. But then she remembered something. This wasn't about her comfort. For the past few days, she had lived among people who didn't care about designer labels, exclusive invitations, or the size of her social media following. They didn't judge her for the kind of car she drove or the places she vacationed. They only cared about who she was when all of that was stripped away. And that realization unsettled her more than she was willing to admit. She rolled over, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. A quiet stillness, unburdened by expectations. Maybe for the first time, she was starting to understand what Keanu had been trying to show her all along. A day of hard work. By mid-morning, Tiffany stood in front of a half-built schoolhouse, watching as volunteers and villagers worked together to mix cement, lay bricks, and paint walls. The hum of activity was constant. People moving, laughing, wiping sweat from their brows but never complaining. She had never done manual labor in her life. The most effort she had ever put into anything physical was lifting shopping bags from the trunk of her Range Rover. And now, she was about to build a wall. Here, Camilla, the volunteer coordinator, handed her a trowel and a pair of worn work gloves. Time to get your hands dirty. Tiffany hesitated, eyeing the wet cement in front of her. It smelled earthy, sticky, completely foreign to anything she had ever touched. She took the trowel awkwardly, feeling utterly useless as she watched the other volunteers move with ease. "Not afraid of a little dirt, are you?" Matteo teased from a few feet away, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Tiffany shot him a half-hearted glare. "I don't do manual labor." "Well, you do now," he said with a grin, slapping a glob of cement onto a brick. "Welcome to the real world, Princessa." Tiffany sighed, knowing there was no getting out of this. She crouched beside Camilla, mimicking her movements as she spread the cement over the bricks. It was harder than it looked. Her first few attempts were messy, uneven, but Camilla simply smiled. "Good," she said. "You'll get better." Better. The word stuck with her. She had spent her entire life chasing perfection, obsessed with status, with being envied, admired, untouchable. But here, no one cared if she was perfect. They only cared if she was willing to try. Breaking down walls, literally and figuratively. Hours passed, and for the first time in years, Tiffany lost track of time. Sweat dripped down her back, her arms ached, her designer manicure was completely ruined. And yet, she didn't hate it. She felt useful. She felt present. For once, she wasn't lost in thoughts of Instagram likes, trending hashtags, or whether her outfit would be featured in a fashion magazine. She was just here, working alongside people who had welcomed her despite her obvious privilege, despite the way she had walked into their world completely clueless. She had expected resentment. Instead, she found acceptance. She glanced up, catching sight of a little girl, Sophia, watching her from the shade of a nearby tree. Her dark brown eyes sparkled with curiosity. "You're not very good at this," Sophia giggled, covering her mouth with her hands. Tiffany laughed, wiping the streak of cement off her cheek. "Yeah, I figured that out." Sophia tilted her head. "But you're trying." Tiffany stilled. The words hit her in a way she hadn't expected. She was trying. For the first time in her life, she was trying to be someone more than the image she had built. A lesson in humility. As the sun set, Tiffany sat with Camila, Matteo, and a few other volunteers on the front steps of the newly built schoolhouse. They ate simple meals, rice, beans, and fresh mangoes, food that was humble but deeply satisfying. "You worked hard today," Camila said, nudging Tiffany's shoulder. Tiffany exhaled, staring at her calloused hands, hands that had never known anything other than luxury, ease, softness. "I think this is the first time I've ever done something that actually mattered," she admitted quietly. Camila smiled knowingly. "And how does it feel?" Tiffany thought for a moment, then answered honestly. "It feels good." It wasn't a dramatic epiphany. There were no sweeping violence or grand realizations. Just a quiet, undeniable truth. She liked who she was becoming. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she ever wanted to go back to who she used to be. The unexpected call. Later that night, as Tiffany lay in bed, exhaustion settling into her bones, her phone buzzed. She reached for it, frowning when she saw the name on the screen. Keanu Reeves. She hesitated before answering. "Did you survive your first few days?" His voice was calm, amused, as if he already knew the answer. Tiffany let out a breathless laugh. "Barely. I think I lost all feeling in my arms." Keanu chuckled. "That's how you know you're doing it right." A comfortable silence stretched between them. Then Keanu spoke again, his tone a little more serious. "Do you get it now?" Tiffany swallowed, closing her eyes. She did. "It's not about the money," she said softly. "It's about what you do with it." Keanu hummed in agreement. "And now that you see it, what are you going to do about it?" Tiffany didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time, she wanted to find one. "I guess I'll figure it out," she said. Keanu's voice held a hint of a smile. "Good. That's the first step." Tiffany lay awake long after the call ended, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the distant sounds of crickets and the gentle rustling of palm trees outside her window. She had come here as a spoiled heiress, a girl who had never lifted a finger for anyone but herself. But maybe, just maybe, she would leave as someone else entirely. And for the first time in her life, she couldn't wait to see who that person would be.